Now, drone technology has transformed industries such as mining, agriculture, construction, infrastructure, and many more. And as the technology becomes an integral part of many sectors, the legal framework governing the use of drones has evolved too. Jaco Meyer, who's director at Cliff Decker Hoffmeyer, joins us to bring us up to speed with understanding the legalities behind the use of this technology here in South Africa. Jaco, thank you for your time. Good afternoon.
Hi, Noluthando. Thank you so much for having me.
Now, of course, in my intro, I would have mentioned some of the industries being impacted by drone technology, in fact, being disrupted. Let's talk about that, just how prevalent this technology is here in the country.
In recent years, South Africa has really embraced drone technology, both for private use and commercial use. We see it used often in the mining industry, in the agriculture industry, in the infrastructure industry, or in environmental monitoring. That's of course more on the commercial side, and this then led to the need to regulate drones. So the legislation is still fairly new. It was only introduced in 2015 by the South African Civil Aviation Authority. They call them remotely piloted aircraft systems, or as they're more colloquially known as drones. And they published it as the regulations as an amendment to the Civil Aviation Act, which regulates all aviation-related activities in the country.
Now, I will tell you this, Jaco, maybe it's because I'm not very familiar with drone technology. It seems bizarre to me that we're speaking about it in the same way that we would be speaking about planes, right? So I want us to speak about that, about the why it is important for us to regulate it at such a level. Is this about security? Is it about risk? What exactly, has us being so tough on regulation?
Yeah, so I think it's perhaps worthwhile to note that the regulations distinguish between drones for private use and drones for commercial use, whereas drones for commercial use are more sort of closely mirrored with manned aircraft. So just to sort of give a brief background between the two, so drones for private use, that is usually used by hobbyists for recreational purposes. And while they're not necessarily required to license or be licensed, they must adhere to safety and security guidelines. Some include maintaining visual line of sight, certain altitude limitations, not flying the drone higher than 120 meters, not flying closer or within 50 meters of people or property, not flying over restricted airspace such as national parks or close to airports. Now, the commercial operations, that refers to operations for economic gain. So this is usually what we see in the industries. And here, there's a bunch of licenses and certifications that are required to actually operate. So similar to manned aircraft, you need a remote pilot license, or you need a license, an aircraft or an air operator certificate, an air service license, and a letter of approval from the Civil Aviation Authority. The reason for this high regulation is mostly for safety, security, and privacy reasons. I mean, you can only imagine sort of the security reasons that may, for example, be seen if drones were to be flown over national parks with our poaching problem, or if drones were to collide with other aircraft in the air. So it's mostly for security and safety reasons.
Very interesting indeed. And of course, like you're saying, the legislation here is quite novel. I'm wondering if industry, people who use the technology, so industry has responded to that, because often, there's a pushback. But of course, the reason that you lay down for this kind of legislation are actually, they make complete sense.
Yeah, so I think as with any legislation before it's adopted, it has to go through a public process in terms of which the public can comment. So there has been some significant stakeholder engagements. And the good thing about a law and about our regulations are that they are flexible and that they sort of do adapt with times. Because, for example, drones will enhance and adapt in the coming future as technology advances and adapts. So we hope to see that flexibility continue.
And looking at the legislation, Jaco, just how complex is it to comply? And the reason I ask this as well is because, there's some laws here in South Africa that are pretty easy for anybody to comply with. I think of getting a driver's license. You kind of know what you have to do, and then you kind of get into the car and you keep it moving. But with something like drones, it looks like it is something that's rather complex, might even need some sort of legal assistance in making sure that the compliance is up to date.
Yeah, so for commercial operators, it is quite technical. And it is overseen and regulated by the South African Civil Aviation Authority. luckily, they're a very robust regulator, and they always welcome engagement with them. And the regulations are quite well drafted, so it sets out exactly what you need to comply with, what you need to submit, the supporting documents. So it is quite technical and it is quite admin and document intensive, but it is, when you look at the regulations, it is quite clear what you need to do.
And is it too far off from international best practice?
When we consider South African regulations with global practice, they share some similarities in terms of things like visual line of sight, weight restrictions, and proximity to hospitals or to airspace. When you look at Africa, South Africa has quite developed regulations compared to the rest of Africa. Egypt and Morocco, for example, have less stringent drone regulations. When you look at the European Union or North America, they again also have very developed drone regulations. What I think South Africa does pretty well is to strike a balance between regulating safety, security, and privacy, while also still trying to encourage investment in this growing industry. But of course, there is always still some criticism that the licensing for commercial operators is quite severe, and that it can be simplified.
And lastly, before I let you go, of course, the onus here to understand this legislation and to make sure that, the right documents and licenses are in place does rest on the user. And I'm just wondering, from that perspective, is this something that one might find out as they buy the drone? Is it at the point of sale? Is it expected that you would know, just to make sure that people aren't also contravening the act without really knowing of it?
Yeah. In certain instances, people who sell drones, especially commercially, are obliged to inform the buyer of some of the regulations and what they need to adhere to. But we generally encourage the public or anyone who intends to operate a drone to seek legal advice, because at the end of the day, it will be much less of a headache to seek legal advice than to deal with the consequences of non-compliance with the regulations.
Absolutely understand that. Well, thank you so much for taking us through this one, Jaco. Very interesting indeed. That was Jaco Meyer, Director at Cliff Decker Hofmeyr.